under government law or else be denied the opportunity to do business in the United States. The ranking member aims to back companies into a corner and force them to break a legally unbreakable contract. I think this is a bad amendment. The House has rejected it in the past, and I would urge the House again and my colleagues to reject it this time, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
May I inquire once again as to how much time is remaining on either side?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 2 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Washington has 3 minutes remaining.
I yield myself 1 minute and 3/4.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute and 3/4.
I thank you. The amendment that I'm offering would give these oil companies a strong incentive to renegotiate their leases to pay their fair share of royalty taxes. My amendment would offer these oil companies a choice. They can choose to either continue to produce royalty tax-free in the Gulf of Mexico on public lands, but not be able to receive any new leases on public lands, or they can agree to pay their fair share and be able to bid on new areas. But they can't have it both ways. With oil prices at $100 a barrel, this free drilling is absolutely unacceptable. The Congressional Research Service has repeatedly found that this amendment would not be an abrogation of contract or constitute a takings. In 2010, the Congressional Research Service wrote of my amendment, to reiterate, the amendment imposes no legal compulsion. Just as in Ruckelshaus, Congress simply would be posing an election. This amendment does not require these companies to renegotiate their leases to pay their fair share. It just gives them an incentive to do so. And this amendment would not force companies to give up their leases. It would just impose a condition in issuing future leases. As CRS has stated, as a general matter, the United States has broad discretion in setting the qualifications of those with whom it contracts. These companies would be perfectly free to choose to continue producing this free windfall oil even if prices climb well past $100 a barrel and gas prices go past $4 a barrel. They can do that. They can hang on to these windfall leases if they want. But if they do, they're not getting any new leases from the American people on the public lands of our country. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment has been defeated so many times on the House floor, it's like one of those bad American Idol tryouts. And there's good reason for it. It is as Chairman Hastings said. In the 1990s, we wanted to encourage more American-made energy, not importing it from the Middle East. So we encouraged companies to explore in the deep waters. They did. American companies invest hundreds of millions of dollars in leases paid to the American government, in new investment, new equipment, and it worked. They found oil and gas. They pumped it. They paid billions of dollars in revenue, in royalties to us based on how much they pumped. The more they pumped, the more they paid the American taxpayer. This outraged our Democrat friends. They've tried to break those American contracts, force the government to go back on its word. Four times the courts have said, including the Supreme Court, said no. The American government's word means something. Today, they want to break that word on the House floor, extort our American companies into breaking those contracts. We're going to say no. The American government contract and the words mean something, and we're going to create the jobs that come from American-made energy.
Gentleman, 1 additional minute.
Gentleman from Texas recognized for an additional 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to reiterate the point you're making. The goal of this amendment is not simply to break America's contracts. It's really to stop American companies from investing here in America and creating jobs from clean natural gas, from oil, from traditional energy that fuels so much of America's economy, to make sure we're reliant on our energy, not on the Middle East or Venezuela. And so the goal of this amendment, the reason it has been killed so many times, is it works against America's energy interests, it works against American energy jobs, and it breaks the rule of law. America's not a banana republic. Our contracts mean something, and we're going to uphold them. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts. The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
These oil giants are the most profitable companies in the history of the world. The Republicans are going to give them $40 billion in tax breaks over the next 10 years, and rather than reclaiming them for our soldiers or for Medicare recipients, they say, no, you can't touch that. And so I turn to them and I say, what about all of the royalty tax-free drilling they're doing? 25% of all oil drilled for off of the coastlines of our country on public lands, no taxes, no royalties, no contribution to America. They're not paying their fair share of the dues. And the gentleman from Texas just said, the more they drill, the more they pay. Absolutely not true. The more they drill, the bigger their profits. They don't have to pay a nickel in royalty taxes. They get off scot-free. Everyone else gets tipped upside down by the tax man on April 15th to pick up what they're not willing to pay. It's time for them to pay their fair share of the dues. That's what the Markey Amendment says. Either start renegotiating those leases or you're not drilling any longer on the public lands of the United States of America. Vote aye.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized for the balance of the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a real, very important principle here, and that is a contract is a contract. You abide by what you negotiate under the existing law. And this existing law has been worked its way through the courts all the way to the Supreme Court. And in every case, the 1995 law and these leases were upheld. Why would we want to jeopardize and send the wrong message to those that would want to take the risk and make the investments under this law? It would just send a very, very wrong signal, in my view. Once again, this amendment has been defeated on this floor a number of times. I urge my colleagues to vote no one more time to defeat this amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will be postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 19, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 19, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-398, offered by Mr. Labrador of Idaho.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, and a member opposed, will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For far too long, the federal government has imposed regulatory burdens that have impeded economic growth and limited our access to domestic energy. This legislation, which passed out of the Natural Resources Committee on a bipartisan basis, establishes a common-sense, streamlined policy for the development of clean geothermal energy resources that will create jobs and provide low-cost energy to American families. In Idaho, we have an abundance of geothermal energy potential that is unavailable due to federal bureaucratic impediments. Idaho has a unique history of developing geothermal energy. I served in the Idaho legislature for 4 years, where our 100-year-old state house is entirely heated by geothermal energy, as are many of our downtown Boise office buildings, old and new. The annual operating costs for generating this abundant heat are essentially zero. Current law requires each geothermal exploration hole to go through an individual environmental review and approval process, discouraging energy companies from investing in projects and curtailing our access to geothermal energy. Each individual environmental review process can take between 10 months to 2 years to complete. Now more than ever, we should encourage private enterprise by removing the regulatory burdens that stall our economic growth. My amendment does just that. What the legislation does: number one, it improves regulations that hamper geothermal exploration and allows projects to be done without the construction of new roads and without the use of off-road motorized vehicles to ensure minimal environmental damage.
Number 2, it protects the environment by requiring the removal of any surface infrastructure to minimize surface impact. And number 3, it sets firm deadlines for permitting to occur, providing the geothermal companies the certainty they need to make appropriate business decisions. This is important. What my amendment does not do, it does not subsidize the geothermal energy industry. It merely eliminates a regulatory hurdle that is unique to the geothermal development process, allowing increased deployment without a tax credit or other cost to the taxpayers. And it also does not allow geothermal development to occur in any of our pristine areas that are currently off-limits to exploration. The bill simply removes bureaucratic layers that companies must endure after they obtain a lease. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment. And I yield
Reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman from Idaho reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
To speak on the amendment.
Is the gentleman opposed?
In opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We're all for geothermal. There's nobody on this side that's opposed to geothermal. We think it's a really good resource. In fact, in my own history, way back in California, the first geothermal wells were drilled when I was on the Resources Committee in the state. We did it well. We required an upfront review of the potential wells, and we continue to do that in California. And it turns out that this particular law would waive the NEPA requirements, simply a categorical exemption for geothermal test wells. Not necessary and not wise. Already the Bureau of Land Management rapidly approves geothermal test wells with a very quick environmental review to determine if there's any potential problem in that particular area from that particular well. In fact, about 72 applications have been made, 47 have been done very quickly. Why were the others not done? There was the potential problem. Perhaps they were near somebody else's resource. Perhaps they were in an area that was environmentally sensitive. Perhaps they were in an area where you could draw down a naturally occurring hot spring or a geyser. So there are reasons for the review, and there is no reason for a categorical exemption, unless, of course, you want to somehow, bit by bit, terminate NEPA, which seems to be the strategy of the Republicans here. Just nibble away enough so that NEPA has no meaning. I would draw the attention to the majority here that the natural gas industry obtained an exemption for natural gas fracking from the EPA, from EPA regulations. The result, at least in Pennsylvania and in New York, was extraordinary trouble for the natural gas industry. So let's not rush forward here. There's a process in place that provides for an exemption, a very quick process to determine if that particular well is appropriate and allowed to go forward. Where there's trouble, don't do it. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, and I thank my colleague from Idaho. I rise in strong support of this amendment. It would streamline the geothermal exploration process to expedite the development of geothermal energy on federal lands. Being from Colorado, I know well the potential for geothermal energy development. In fact, just last year, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, teamed up with IKEA to build the first IKEA store in the United States that is partially powered by geothermal energy. As our nation heads down the path of energy security, we should be facilitating the development of renewable energy on federal land. This is a good amendment that could potentially shave years off of the process of geothermal energy exploration and contribute to our increasing domestic energy portfolio in the United States. I urge your support of the Labrador Amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back to the gentleman from Idaho.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back. The gentleman from Idaho reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
May I ask the remaining time?
The gentleman from California has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Sounds good, doesn't it? Until the well happens to destroy the neighbor's well. Until the well happens to destroy one of the many hot springs or geysers that exist in public parks. national parks. Sounds good until you begin to understand the implications of what happens when there is no environmental review. Oh yeah, it sounds good, but I'll guarantee you this, that if this exemption goes forward, it will only be a matter of time before there is a major controversy over the exploration of a well and the effect on surrounding resources. If that's what the majority wants, then go ahead. The result will be a huge blow-up, such as we now see with fracking. We don't need that. What we need to do is rapidly expand our geothermal production in America. And there are many different resources available to us. I would just remind my friend from Colorado that the kind of geothermal he's talking about is not the deep well hot geothermal, but rather a geothermal that uses the ambient temperature of the soil several feet deep into the ground. That's a different kind of geothermal situation. What we're talking about here is tapping a hot portion of the earth and extracting from that the energy that's possible. Do it with care, because there is the potential for very serious problems if you do it incorrectly. Take a look. And by the way, to our knowledge, the geothermal industry is not interested in this exemption. There may be some company out there, but in testimony before the committee, it was clear that the geothermal industry said, we don't need this. Things are moving along the way we want them to move along. And understand that there is competition between geothermal companies. One person may be on this side of the geothermal resource, another on the other side. A third person, a third entity comes in, tries to extract the oil in a test well, the energy in a test well, and voila, now we've got conflict. Without a review, those things will happen. No need for a categorical exemption. Reserve the remaining time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time we have left?
The gentleman has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Okay, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate my friend and colleague from Idaho for this bill. And let me correct just one statement that was made just a moment ago. The geothermal industry testified in our committee in favor of this bill. But there seems to be a pattern here when we talk about activity on federal land, which of course is under the jurisdiction of the committee that I have the privilege to share. And if I hear it once, I hear it dozens of times, and we hear it virtually in all the testimony we hear of issues that come before our committee, is the red tape that you have to go through to utilize our public lands for multiple purpose use. And let me just say this, Mr. Chairman. Our public lands were designed, unless Congress sets aside specifically, multiple use. That means commercial activity, that means recreational activity, a wide variety of activities. But when we have these other laws that inhibit that use, then I think it works against what the American people are trying to accomplish. This is a very simple process that says, goodness, if you have a lease in an area, why do you have to have so much redundancy to do the same thing over and over again? I think this amendment is a good amendment. As I mentioned, it passed out of the committee on a bipartisan vote, and I urge adoption, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Idaho reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I suppose it's time to just finish up this debate. A quick quote from Paul Thompson of Ormat Technologies in committee representing the geothermal industry at the legislative hearing June 23, 2011. Quote, if we can get implementation that is consistent with the current policy, we'd be very happy with that. I don't think it necessarily requires a total exemption from NEPA. Let it be that. We'll go on. No, I don't have much time. You can use your time, sir. Don't need an exemption. And it was just stated, if you got an area, a resource area, what difference does it make if somebody drills within that area? I can tell you what difference it makes. In California, the geysers, a huge resource, one of the very first in the United States, it makes a great deal of difference where somebody else drills in your neighborhood, because that drilling can dry up your resource. It is exceedingly important to understand the geology, understand the environmental risks associated with exploratory and then the development. No need for an exemption, unless, of course, you want to once again nibble away at NEPA until it's not worth having at all, which apparently is the strategy we're seeing from this committee and these numerous amendments. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for the remaining 30 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I think let's correct two statements that were just made. Number one, the Chamber of Commerce and the geothermal industry testified in our committee that they're for this, and I have letters from them saying that they're for this amendment. And number two, the boogeyman that they keep using is geyser holes and other things. The EIS for geothermal leasing in the Western United States expressly states that the BLM is prohibited from issuing leases on the following lands: lands contained within a unit of the National Park System or that are otherwise administered by the National Park System. They continue to use Yellowstone and all these other boogeymen, and we know that that's not true because we cannot do any leasing or any geothermal activity in any of those lands. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. All times expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Please.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho will be postponed.
Can we wait just 1 second?
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 20, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 20, printed in Part A of House Report Number 112-398, offered by Mr. Scalise of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 547, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we approach the 2-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, my amendment sets up the Gulf Coast Restoration Trust Fund and requires that 80% of the Clean Water Act fines that will be directed to the fund for the purposes of restoring the ecosystems and economies that were directly impacted by the oil spill. This amendment shares strong bipartisan support and is the first step in ensuring that the Gulf Coast states have the ability to recover from the largest environmental disaster in our country's history. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Louisiana reserves. For what purpose does the gentlelady rise?
To claim the time in opposition.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself 3 minutes.
The gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, in the aftermath of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, a consensus was reached that 80% of the Clean Water Act fines and penalties that BP is required to pay because of the damage go to the Gulf Coast. President Obama has proposed this. A bipartisan group of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle agreed to this. A national commission recommended it. Another national task force recommended it. Businesses, environmentalists, we've all reached consensus that 80% of the fines and penalties that BP will be required to pay for violating the Clean Water Act go to Gulf of Mexico recovery and research. But see, Congress must pass a law to do this. And everyone has urged the Congress to act on this. But the Congress has not done so, unfortunately. And as the co-chair of the Bipartisan Gulf Coast Caucus, I ask my colleagues not to let the effort languish any longer. The House should act expeditiously to do so and devote 80% of the Deepwater Horizon fines and penalties to the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, the Scalise Amendment could be interpreted as an endorsement of a particular piece of legislation, the Restore Act. And while the Restore Act does devote 80% of the fines and penalties to the Gulf Coast, it is flawed in its current form and does not achieve meaningful recovery for the Gulf of Mexico. So while I urge my colleagues reluctantly to defeat this amendment, the time is now for the Congress to pass an 80% bill and focus on the economic and environmental recovery of the Gulf of Mexico. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would remind my colleague from Florida that this legislation actually is the only instrument available that is germane to this legislation that does direct 80% of those BP fines to the Gulf Coast states, as the President's Commission and many others have called for, who support our legislation, the Restore Act, by the way. With that, I'd like to yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 45 seconds.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for the time. Thank you for all you've done to bring this forward. I also want to thank all my colleagues from the Gulf Coast who fought so hard to make sure that this legislation came to the floor. And I would say that given the time that I have, that this amendment is vital, and it's important to not only the state of Florida, but the entire Gulf Coast area, because it would return a great portion of the fines that will ultimately be paid for the oil spill back to the Gulf Coast. The amendment is the first step in a very long process to make sure that BP and the other responsible parties are held responsible and would start to restore the Gulf Coast from the damages that were suffered as a result of the worst oil spill in the history of the world. So I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and I do yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
At this time, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to our colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Florida. I rise today in support of the amendment from my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise. And I'd like to just remind the Chair that it was a little less than 2 years ago when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred, and we lost 11 Americans. We lost the lives of 11 Americans, and over 200 million gallons of oil was spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. Also, when you look at the damage that occurred, you have to remember that the year of the spill, our shrimp supply was down 37%. Crab was down 39%. Every day when a waitress or a waiter or a bartender went to work, they made less money. Business owners were making less money to make ends meet, all because of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So what we want to make sure with this amendment is that those who suffered actually recoup the benefit of it so that they can protect their coast and make sure that they protect their citizens from future hurricanes, not only their citizens, but protect a big investment of this country. When we talk about our ports, when we talk about the oil and gas industry, I would just remind my colleagues that when Katrina happened, oil and gas prices, well, the gas prices went up 48 cents around the country. That's because Louisiana was suffering and we could not produce the oil and gas we normally produce. So this bill allows us to protect the coast, protect America's energy investment, and also make sure that we can save the lives of Louisiana citizens. And the last thing that I will add is that we should not let the 200 million gallons of oil and 11 lives that were lost open up an opportunity for a windfall for the American Treasury. We should make sure that these funds go exactly to where they should go so that we can help the Gulf Coast, which is so vital to this country's energy independence and the seafood that we all enjoy. So I would again just say that, Mr. Chairman, that I rise in support of the amendment. It's not perfect, it's not the end all, but this is the best way right now to make sure that the sentiment is established that 80% of the fines should go to those coastal communities so that they can help their own recovery. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I would like to allocate 45 seconds to the distinguished gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Bonner.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 45 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm pleased to join my colleagues today in support of this amendment. Let's be clear. Today's amendment, even if adopted, is not the end of our efforts to make the Gulf Coast whole after the tragic BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill almost 2 years ago. But make no mistake, this amendment is critically important as a step toward that end. The creation of the Gulf Coast Restoration Trust Fund is absolutely essential if we're going to ensure that the penalties paid by BP and the other responsible parties are set aside for future expenditure to remediate the long-term environmental and economic damages done to each of the 5 Gulf Coast states. Mr. Chairman, the federal government should not benefit from the tragedy that occurred in our backyard. And I can't say enough in thanks to Chairman Hastings and his leadership in giving us this opportunity with this amendment for this broader effort. I urge adoption. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
I'll reserve my time.
Gentlelady from Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
At this point, Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleague from Louisiana for yielding. Nearly 2 years ago, the Deepwater Horizon explosion took the lives of 11 Americans, and 4 of those were Mississippians, and caused an oil spill of epic proportions. For 86 days, millions of barrels of oil gushed into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, washed up on our beaches, and threatened the ecosystems and the economic stability of an entire region of the country. The road to recovery for the Gulf Coast has been a long one, and it's not over. With this amendment, we take a huge step forward in making things right for those most devastated by this spill. These fines are not taxpayer funds. The federal government, as my colleague from Alabama said, should not profit from the Gulf Coast's pain and suffering. At a time when Congress agrees on so little, this effort has broad bipartisan support in both houses of Congress, and external too, conservation and sportsmen. Many agree that restoring and replenishing the Gulf Coast is more than a responsible decision. It is the right thing to do. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentlelady from Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I would like to yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Southerland.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from Louisiana for yielding. I also would like to commend him on his leadership regarding the work that we have performed on this bipartisan effort to really restore the Gulf of Mexico. You know, the 5 states that were affected most, their representatives here, many who have already spoken today, have worked extremely hard to make sure that the federal government never profits at the pain and the suffering of those who call the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf Coast their home. This has been a wonderful experience to work across the aisle with many who understand how critical it is that we take care of the men and women, the hardworking men and women along the Gulf Coast. And I just urge approval and passage of this amendment, and thank you for the time you've given me. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentlelady from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Louisiana.
Can I acquire the balance of the time, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman has 1 3/4 minutes remaining.
Okay, at this time, I would yield 45 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 45 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment introduced by my friend and colleague on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from Louisiana. In April of 2011, the Deepwater Horizon rig exploded, killing 11 workers and starting the worst oil spill in U.S. history. While the whole nation suffered, the 5 Gulf states were particularly hard hit. Each of our 5 states suffered differing damages. A moratorium was ordered that sent U.S. jobs overseas with the rigs that went overseas. Tourism on some of our most pristine beaches was lost. The shrimping and fishing industries were unable to bring their catches home. And while the Restore Act will not replace the lives lost, it will ensure that the 5 states most impacted by the spill get their fair share of the compensation for our damages. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and come back to the Gulf. I yield back.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve.
Gentlelady from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Louisiana.
I'm prepared to close, Mr. Chairman, so I would reserve and allow the gentlelady from Florida to close.
The gentleman from Louisiana reserves. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to see so much bipartisan support for legislation to devote 80% of the fines and penalties under the Clean Water Act from the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster to the Gulf of Mexico. And I reluctantly have to oppose this amendment because the amendment is entitled Restore, and that is one of the pieces of legislation that, on the one hand, does devote 80%, but on the other is completely flawed. So for that reason, I'm going to have to urge everyone to vote no. But let's not lose momentum here. Let's redouble our efforts in this Congress as soon as possible to pass legislation that does devote 80% of the fines and penalties to the Gulf of Mexico. The problems with the Restore Act are many. It does not focus on Gulf-wide research and recovery. It does not devote the kind of resources to long-term monitoring in the Gulf of Mexico that many other areas in America enjoy. It potentially will duplicate the natural resource damage assessment billions flowing to the impacted areas. For those reasons, I urge a no vote.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Hastings, for his support in helping this. Despite the gentlelady from Florida's comments, the Restore Act actually has a broad range of support, not only from over 30 members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, but also from numerous outside groups, both on the environmental side and on the business side. I would like for the record to include, ask unanimous consent, to include all of these letters from various business and environmental groups in support of the Restore Act.
The gentleman's unanimous consent request will need to be made in the full House.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is a crucial first step towards ensuring that 80% of the BP Clean Water Act funds will be dedicated to help Gulf Coast states, and especially our fragile ecosystems along coastal Louisiana, to fully recover from the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Just the other day, Parish President Billy Nungesser from Plaquemines Parish brought me these pictures that were taken just 2.5 weeks ago from South Plaquemines in our marsh, where you can still see clearly dead turtles, oil in the marsh. We're going to be dealing with these impacts for years to come, Mr. Chairman, and we've seen from other disasters that the proper way to do it is by setting aside those funds to make sure that BP, the responsible parties, not the federal government, pay to restore that damage. I urge support of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
He's going to offer a motion that the committee rise, and this is how you'll put the question on it. For what purpose?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I move the committee to now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 3408, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 3408 and has come to no resolution thereon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a conference report to accompany H.R. 3630.
The clerk will report the title.
Conference report to accompany H.R. 3630, an act to provide incentives for the creation of jobs and for other purposes.
Ordered printed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 3408.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 547 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 3408. Will the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, kindly resume the chair?
In the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 3408, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to set clear rules for the development of United States oil shale resources to promote shale technology research and development and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today, Amendment number 20, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398 by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, had been disposed of. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part A of House Report 112-398, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 13 by Mr. Thompson of California. Amendment number 15 by Ms. Hanabusa of Hawaii. Amendment number 16 by Mr. Hastings of Washington. Amendment number 17 by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. Amendment number 18 by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts. Amendment number 19 by Mr. Labrador of Idaho. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is on the request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 13, printed in Part A of House Report 112-398 by the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 13, printed in Part A of House Report number 112-398, offered by Mr. Thompson of California.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House this afternoon finishing up work on amendments to a bill which would expand domestic and offshore oil and gas drilling and approve the Keystone XL pipeline. It is part of the Surface Transportation Bill, the $260 billion 5-year surface transportation bill. Consideration of a number of amendments and some 6 amendment votes on the House floor. This first one is by Mike Thompson of California. It's an amendment that would clarify that the bill does not allow for oil and gas drilling off the northern coast of California. This first amendment vote is 15 minutes. Also within the last hour or so on Capitol Hill, negotiators, House and Senate negotiators, have signed off on a deal that would extend the Social Security payroll tax cut through the end of the year. It would renew benefits for long-term unemployment and also prevent a cut in the reimbursement rates for Medicare physicians. We spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter a short while ago for some details on the agreement. Reporting for The Hill, Bernie Becker, now that House and Senate negotiators have settled on a plan to extend a payroll tax cut, when will we see votes in the House and Senate?
That does seem to be the next big question. So the House is, by the rules, the next day they would supposed to be able to vote would be Saturday. But all indications are that they would not want to do that. They just want to get this wrapped up tomorrow. They'll waive that rule, and they certainly don't want to have this fester over recess. So chances are that both the House and the Senate will get this done tomorrow.
On the agreement itself, what do you know of how they resolved paying for the bill?
Well, earlier this week, and what seems like to have been the big sort of energizer to this, House Republican leaders dropped their demand that the payroll tax be offset. That's about $100 billion, or about 2/3 of the entire deal. And then over the last few days, there have just been some last talks about how to offset the Medicare doc fix and the unemployment insurance, which were the other 2 parts. And then last night, one of their proposed offsets was federal pension cuts, and some Maryland Dems had some issues with that, and then they've made a last-second compromise on that, and they seem to have, everybody seems to be on the same page.
So they're on the same page, and your sense from this is that when it comes to, at least to the House, it will pass?
It will. I think if you talk to sort of people in the know in the House, they'll say that it probably won't pass just with GOP votes, that they will need Dems on this. There are some more conservative Tea Party types in the House that will not go for this, but all 5 Dems in the House that were on the conference committee did sign it. So all indications are that there will be a bipartisan majority on that side.
You mentioned some of the Maryland representatives, some Washington area lawmakers with the concerns over that provision that requires federal government employees to pay more into their pension funds. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us of the final compromise, or do you know yet?
We do seem to have some sense. It seems like what they got was the changes to contributions to retirement stuff will only start with new employees. Folks who are already on on the rolls will get to sort of stay where they are, and the folks who start new will know basically exactly where they stand.
Well, earlier it had been reported Ben Cardin, obviously a Maryland senator, had some concerns about that. How about the Senate? What's the timetable there, and will it pass in the Senate as well?
Well, that does seem to be the more interesting question. I think what you saw is that Senate GOPers on the conference committee look like they're not going to sign it, and that gave Cardin a little extra leverage to get those sorts of changes he wanted. And it's, you know, this doesn't seem like it's quite as good a deal for the GOP, so there's not as much incentive for Republicans in the Senate to support this.
So conceivably this could arrive on President Obama's desk this weekend. What's his position? Is he likely to sign it?
Oh, he's definitely likely to sign it. He has called this if not the top priority for 2012. I think he thinks this will definitely help the economy, and if it helps the economy, it likely helps his re-election chances.
Reporting on the payroll tax cut conference agreement, Bernie Becker with The Hill. Read his reporting at thehill.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And since that interview on the floor of the Senate, Democratic Senator Mark Warner announced his opposition to the extension, the agreement reached by payroll tax cut conferees. This is a 15-minute vote on the House floor, one of several amendment votes to the piece of legislation on the Surface Transportation Bill, the legislation that deals with expanding oil and gas drilling. But back to the agreement reached by negotiators. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, shortly after the agreement was made firm this afternoon, said he's pleased there's an agreement for the extension of the payroll tax cut. He was joined by other Democratic senators for comments with reporters.
They only want to know when we're done. Right?
I'm glad that the conferees were able to reach an agreement on this historic piece of legislation. This legislation will let middle-class families keep more of their money, and it will allow the economy to continue to grow. If passed, this legislation will also guarantee that hardworking Americans looking for a job in this tough economy will not have the safety net ripped out from under them. And it will ensure that seniors who rely on Medicare will have a doctor to take care of them. I commend the members of the conference committee for their hard work in developing this proposal. It involves a lot of money, and we understand that. Not everyone got everything they wanted, but that's the nature of a compromise, especially when you have a divided government in that the House is controlled by a large number of Republicans and we have a small majority over here as Democrats. It's been a long process, and it's not yet over. The next step, of course, is to pass this conference agreement. Despite the bipartisan nature of this agreement, it's unfortunate so far that my Republican colleagues here in the Senate appear to be withholding their support. Just last week, my counterpart, Senator McConnell, said, and I quote, "Let's allow the conferees to finish their work. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to get this done," end of quote. He also said as follows: Republicans strongly support extending this tax cut for the rest of the year. Where are they? At the same time that he said this, I said I was skeptical that Senate Republicans truly supported this tax cut for the middle class. With my colleagues withholding their support, it appears my skepticism was really justified. This should not be a fight. This is a bipartisan agreement to do good things for the American people, supported by a majority of the American people. In short, this is a perfect example of the common sense solutions that we should have here all the time. We shouldn't have to have a knockdown, drag-out fight on everything we do. So I have a simple message for my Republican colleagues. Let's get this done as quickly as possible. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Senator Reid. This chart tells a story. It's an indication of what's happened with job creation in America under President George W. Bush with the red bars and under President Barack Obama with the blue bars. It's an indication of the loss of jobs that President Obama was facing as he came to office and the dramatic turnaround now that has resulted in 5 straight months of reduction in the unemployment rate across America. The reason why this has happened is because we have a policy that is working. It includes unemployment benefits for those who are out of work, and it includes a payroll tax cut for working Americans. Across my state of Illinois and across the nation, it's up to $1,000 a month. And for families struggling from paycheck to paycheck, extra $100 a month can make a big difference dealing with gasoline prices near $4 a gallon and other expenses that families face. What we've been able to achieve with this bipartisan agreement is to extend this payroll tax cut for the remainder of the year in the hopes that we can continue to see this kind of private sector job creation, which will bring us out of this recession. We're also offering a helping hand to those who are out of work, struggling to find a job, and in addition, with the so-called doc fix, making certain that Medicare recipients can still have the doctor of their choice serving them as they need it. This is a breakthrough. After all of the problems that we've had over the past year with threatened government shutdowns and threatened shutdowns of the economy, the fact that we have reached this agreement ahead of the deadline is an indication that we can work together for the good of this country. Now we need to work in good faith to put the votes on the board in the House and in the Senate to pass this before we leave for this recess. I think this is the best thing to keep the American economy moving forward. I hope our Republicans will join us in the Senate and the House to give a good, strong roll call of support.
Sure. Well, we all know how the Senate works, and it goes without saying that this deal will not pass unless Leader McConnell gives it his blessing. Even if he won't vote for it himself, he needs to allow enough of his members to support it so it can pass. But a strange dynamic is going on here. You have a situation where, for once, the House Republicans are negotiating a responsible package and standing by it. But the Senate Republican leadership seems to be linking arms with the far right. It's usually Speaker Boehner who gets dragged along by the Tea Party. But this time, it looks like it may be the Senate Republican leadership. I don't get how not one Senate Republican conferee would sign a deal negotiated by their own party and endorsed by Speaker Boehner. Everyone remembers how Senator McConnell negotiated a bipartisan deal 2 months ago, only to be abandoned by Speaker Boehner, who said he never signed off on it. Well, like no one believed it in December when the Speaker said he never signed off on Leader McConnell's deal. No one believes the Senate Republicans now when they say Dave Camp and the Speaker struck this deal without their input. By the way, at a press conference today, Speaker Boehner said that Senator McConnell had been consulted. So there appears to be strange divisions emerging between the House and Senate Republicans these days. This week, there was a story in the Capitol Hill newspaper with the headline, "McConnell staying at arm's length from Boehner." Just today, there was a story about how the Senate Republicans are angry at their House counterparts for hurting their chances of gaining control of the Senate. Well, this agreement that helps middle-class families, senior citizens, and those who have been looking for work is too important to be jeopardized by political rivalries between Republicans in the House and Republicans in the Senate.
You know, I hear the same thing from middle-class families every single weekend when I go home. More than anything, they want certainty and they want security. They want peace of mind and the assurance that back here in this Washington we aren't working against each other, we're working for them. That's why, as Senate Democrats, we've been working hard to make sure they have the support they need if they get laid off. It's why we've pushed Republicans to extend support for doctors, to provide Medicare for our seniors. And it's why we have insisted on a middle-class tax cut for our hard-working families. And here we are, finally, after months of Republicans dragging their feet on a full-year extension, and after struggling to just get 2 months of middle-class support over the holidays, we are now on the verge of a deal that is not perfect by any means, but will tell families in my state and across the country that we're looking out for you and for our economic recovery. But of course, with the Republicans here in the Senate, the waiting is always the hardest part. And today they have again left middle-class families waiting with bated breath. After every other member of the conference committee has signed off on this deal, Senate Republicans are MIA. We are left once again to wonder, are they ever going to join us in fighting for those who need it the most? You know, today I was reminded of who it is that really needs our help and just who it is that will benefit from this deal. This afternoon I spoke downtown to a room full of unemployed veterans who'd made it all the way to here to Washington, D.C. just to participate in a job training program that GE was putting on. These are our nation's heroes. They're just back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and many among them are part of the millions of Americans who are collecting unemployment benefits or depending heavily on the $40 a month in their paycheck that this tax cut provides. I talked to these veterans about how we as a nation are at a crossroads, a moment where it will be decided whether we are going to step up as a country to provide the opportunities that they deserve. This vote is as critical to them as it is to every middle-class American family. And together, they are all looking right now to Senate Republicans to do the right thing.
Questions?
Senator Reid, Senator Warner just said on the floor that he'd be voting against the payroll deal. How many Republicans do you think you need to get this thing passed tomorrow?
We should ask Senator McConnell that. I just read the quotes. He said this should be something we should all work together on, and I think that's the case.
Senator, what are your thoughts on the cutback in the weeks on the unemployment insurance compensation with your state being in such a tough shape?
Both state of Nevada and the high unemployment states, of course, do very well under the new formula. Remember, everybody, prior to 2008, the longest period of time we had extended benefits was 46 weeks, and that was for a very short period of time. We've gone up to 99 weeks, recognizing the very difficult times that people are having around the country with work. So we worked through this. It was done, I think, with responsiveness, and I think it recognizes the problem we still have in America. That's why we weren't willing to cut back where the Republicans want us to go back to.
Senator Reid, on that point, can you just address, some Republicans today have said that it's a disincentive to keep extending unemployment insurance benefits. It's a disincentive for people to find work. Can you, since you've been a proponent of this, can you?
Everybody that says that has a job. It's extremely difficult to be in Nevada. We have an unemployment rate that says about 13%, but that's not accurate because we know there are many people who have gone off the unemployment rolls. The state of Nevada and the country is still in need of lots of jobs. So anyone who says that doesn't understand the situation. People who are drawing those benefits are obligated to look for work, and they do that. We were unwilling to do some of the mean-spirited things to further embarrass people who were recipients of unemployment insurance.
Senator Reid, lawmakers from Maryland
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Sorry. Legislators from Virginia and Maryland are not happy with this deal and what it's doing for federal workers. I'm wondering how long federal worker cuts to pensions as an offset was part of these negotiations.
It's not just the senators from Maryland and Virginia. I'm personally aggrieved. I expressed that in the caucus today. We have lots of federal employees in Nevada. We have two huge military bases. Nellis Air Force Base, more than 10,000 people are either stationed there or work there. In fact, it's about 12,000. We have a very large base in Fallon. The two premier airplane fighter training facilities that we have in the world are in Nevada. Fallon for the Navy, Air Force, Nellis. But we have large numbers of other federal employees. And so I think it's too bad that the House of Representatives, with their significant Republican majority, forced us, in one sense, to go along with this. I think that federal employees have been used as a battering ram. The Republicans don't like the federal government, and they're doing anything they can to take a whack at it. Federal employees, of which there are lots of them right here on Capitol Hill, work very, very hard. And I'm sorry that the Republicans have tried to use them as a whipping post for some of their ideological needs.
Senator Reid, in what's left of this election year, do you see any other avenues on which you can get anything done and work with Republicans?
First of all, we have a lot election year left. We have this highway bill. We're going to finish the highway bill. We're not going to lose this bipartisan bill because of the number of people who are determined to bring down anything that's good for the country. We focus on the Republican caucus in the House all the time about it being overwhelmed with Tea Party folks. Well, we have the same situation in the Senate. It just doesn't get as much focus. And we're going to work through this. We're going to take some votes that aren't related to this bill, but it's something we need to do. I believe very strongly that this surface transportation bill is one of the most important things we can do. After we complete this, and I'm confident and hopefully we will, we're here to talk about this today. We need to do that. We're going to do the postal reform. We have all of our appropriation bills that McConnell and I have said that it's important we do them this year. So we have a lot of time to do a number of very important things, and we'll continue that. And I haven't even mentioned which got a little bit of play in the press today. That's our cybersecurity bill. The Pentagon has said this is the most important issue that's facing them. We're going to do that. That's important. So we got a lot of things to do. One last question?
If I could just follow, so
sure.
you don't have any intention of just folding your tents and letting everything play out for the rest of the year?
No, I'm not much of a tent folder. And either is my caucus.
Senator, how do you address the payroll tax deal is funded in part by $5 billion taken out of the Health Loss Prevention Fund? That's a third of the funding. So doesn't taking that much money out of the prevention fund hurt?
First of all, the payroll tax, none of that's unpaid
Not the payroll
for.
tax, but the whole package pays for it.
Understand, prevention is something I worked hard to make sure that was in the health reform bill, and it's a very good program, led by Senator Harkin and Mikulski and a number of others. But we put in the law that this fund continually grows, and it is growing. And the money that we're taking out of this, and that's why the President suggested $4.5 billion be taken out of it. This program will grow at the rate of about $2 billion a year in just a few years. So this is not a loss overall to the program. We feel confident that this program will be able to go forward. It accumulates money every year, and that's the way we set it up to do. We think the vote, we don't know for sure. They haven't filed over there yet. They should be doing it soon. And as soon as they file this, we will do a hotline to find out how many of our folks want to talk. We hope not many. And then I'm told that the House intends to do this sometime around 1 o'clock tomorrow. That being the case, and not a lot of talk, we could get to it fairly quickly. We have a total of 4 votes that we'd like to complete before we leave here. One is on cloture on this surface transportation bill. One is on Jesse Furman, a judge to be from New York. And then we have cloture and then final passage on the conference report. Oh, yeah. You bet.
Democratic senators from just a short while ago talking about the agreement that's been reached by negotiators on the payroll tax cut, which would extend the payroll tax cut through the end of this year. On unemployment, it would guarantee up to 89 or 99 weeks of unemployment insurance through May, depending on the state. Also, in terms of the Medicare, it would fix what's called the sustainable growth rate. It would Medicare physician rates had been scheduled to be reduced as of March 1st by 27%. They agreed to avoid that and extend the current Medicare payment rates through, again, the end of this year. And it is likely that we will see votes in both the House and Senate. Daniel Newhouser, who is a reporter for Roll Call, tweets that the payroll bill is on the Rules Committee website. A Saturday vote would be okay under the Pledge to America. Leadership still thinking about a Friday vote, though. You can follow congressional reporters, twitter.com/cspan, and look for the list. On the House floor right now, the first of several amendment votes to the offshore oil and gas drilling bill that's part of the surface transportation debate.
On this vote, the yeas are 167, the nays are 253. The amendment is not adopted. The unfinished business is on the request for recorded vote on amendment number 15, printed in Part A, House Report 112-398, by the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa, on which further proceedings were postponed.